Hello and welcome to the Small Engines of Growth, Understanding Creative Microclusters and Why Mapping the Sector is Important. Unfortunately, during our conference at the weekend, Dr. Inge Hill was taken ill, and so therefore I took on board a lot of the research because I'd already pre-read the research and was involved in some of it at the early stages, and so therefore I took over from her presentation. So my name is Andrew Knutt again. So let's crack on. So hands up those who know who Nesta are. This was something that we asked people in the conference to do. Not many people put their hands up, but Nesta stands for National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, and they were established in 1998. Now, Nesta is the UK's innovation agency for social good, and they work from all sorts of sectors, so creative industries to the technology sector. They work with the environment sector and also social innovation in the sense of social services. And it also provides grants and loan programs, not all the time, but some of the time. So worth going to their website if you look for Nesta. It's a really good resource to look at. Now, in 2016, Nesta revealed its research, which was called the Geography of Creativity in the UK, of 47 identified creative clusters across the UK. But however, these were focused on big cities and large conurbations, and it makes sense anyway, doesn't it? Because if you're going to be looking for a cluster of anything, you're going to find them in places where there are big cities. Now, creative clusters are groups of creative industry businesses. They're not-for-profit enterprises, cultural institutions, art venues, individual artists, and networks. And I think these images here can give you a great overview of what we mean by the sort of creative cluster. Now, hands up those who know who AHRC is. Well, they are the acronym for the Arts and Humanities Research Council, established in 1998 as well. And they're a good newsletter you can get as well, so I would suggest that. But anyway, creative clusters. So AHRC, backed with government funding, launched the Creative Clusters Programme in 2018. Now, it was a £120 million investment, and it was designed to drive innovation across the UK creative industries and to encourage a new type of applied research. Now, £80 million of that £120 million was shared between 9 clusters for a 5-year programme. So that's a lot of money. And actually, if you know the Watershed in Bristol, they were one of the ones that got that particular funding. So Bristol was a creative cluster that got found. So what did they do, these creative clusters or this program? Well, basically it was supporting, the finest in fashion, film and television, informatics, design, computer games, arts performance, and immersive technology. Now, of course, that's an easy win for government because their investment, one would expect to find these clusters all gathered up in urban areas and cities and so forth. But there was a little bit of an issue. So PEC, which stands for Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, in November 2020 published a new report on microclusters rather than creative clusters. And the whole idea was to see whether there were other sort of creative clusters, but in a smaller context. So that's what they call them, microclusters. Now, to obtain that data, PEC used basically an algorithm that went off and scraped data from 200,000 websites and businesses. But to enable the sort of algorithm software to know where these businesses were located, the algorithm would only register websites that had addresses, so they knew where the location was. And they was also backed up by some one-to-one surveys as well. Now, I just want to make a personal statement here because I don't know about you, but the many freelancers that I know, and I know designers, even theatre makers, music studios, filmmakers, a lot of them do have websites, but not a lot of them have addresses, and perhaps the reason being is because they might be operating from home, or they just want to divulge their address because they may have lots of equipment there. I'm not positively sure, but there's plenty of good reasons why. So this tells us that obviously this data could be improved through perhaps manual research, people actually sitting in front of a computer and actually ringing people up and all that sort of stuff. Now, I just want to sort of also mention a little irony behind this. So back in 2020, I believe it was, SABCA applied for what was known as the Community Renewal Fund, and we asked for £500,000 over a year period, and a large part of that money was to go towards basically a mapping exercise where we could do some manual research, find out where all these arts and cultural organizations are, whether they be social enterprise, business, practitioner, community group, whatever. And then we could really get a real good clear picture of where the clusters were as such, and which towns had more than others and all that sort of stuff. Unfortunately, fortunately, the county council actually said it was a great project, and so they submitted our paper to national government, but national government said that it wasn't didn't reach the criteria that they thought they wanted, which was a shame. But the irony of it is, 6 months later, a £1.75 million programme called the Create Growth Programme came out, and there was a large part of that application that said, can you prove that you've got critical mass? Is there enough creative organizations in your area? How many of them are growing? That sort of stuff. So we couldn't apply for that particular piece of funding because we didn't have the data. So the irony is that well, you can see the moral story. The moral of the story is, if we can get every organization to join, say, the likes of SABCA, to make sure they're being mapped, and that we can contact them on a regular basis to see how they're doing, what they need, and so forth, it would make a big difference to potential funding pots and bring inward investment into the arts and cultural sector. So anyway, I digress slightly there. Anyway, going back to that microcluster research, the research identified 709 creative microclusters around the UK. A third of those microclusters are located outside of established large creative clusters. So just to reiterate, you've got the creative clusters, which are the big ones in cities and urban areas, and then you've got the microclusters. So obviously a third of those were just outside of those microclusters. Now, in Somerset, though, it did identify 7 microclusters in Somerset, and I did a count. This was representing over 1,000 businesses in Somerset, and it also illustrates the diversity and dispersal of the UK creative industries, not just in our county, but in England in general. And those 2 logos that you can see on the slide there is 2 of the organisations that assisted that research with AHRC. So let's have a quick look at some of these maps that the research brought out. So as you can see on the left, you have the sort of purple bit of England, and you've got all those black dots. Well, that represents over 25,000 rural creative companies. But as you look into the sort of coloured bit, which is the text in the middle, it says each colour represents one of the 86 rural creative microclusters across England that were identified. And we can see those there. So if you look in the southwest, especially where Somerset is, you can see there's some up near Bath as well and around that sort of area. But anyway, the research shows that the average cluster size was about 104 firms or businesses. So that gives you a good idea of what that sort of data looks like, especially from a Somerset perspective. Now, what's interesting, if you look in the purple text at the bottom, this was something I mentioned at the conference, which is that in September 2022, the government launched its Rural England Prosperity Fund, which looks at developing, enterprise and business in rural areas. And of course, data like this is ideal for supporting applications like that. So it may be worth you considering looking at creative microclusters if you are applying for the Rural England Prosperity Fund. Now, if you want to find out some more, there are 2 interactive maps that you can access online. Rather than give you the web addresses, my suggestion is for the microclusters that you literally type into Google England's Rural Creative Microclusters. You can put PEC on the end if you want, and that will take you straight to the web page. And if you scroll down on that page, you'll find a map link, and then you can use those interactive maps. You can zoom in and out and see where they are and everything else. The creative microclusters small engines for growth bit that I mentioned earlier, that was also there, so you can search for that on Google as well. And again, you can see that on these slides here. Now, from the previous research that AHRC had done, and looking at the benefits that companies have when they're in creative clusters, one of them is access to skills. So they obviously have more access to skills, which obviously then in turn really does give you knowledge. And of course, they had access to more customers, and they had access to more lifestyle and amenities. So it goes to show that when you develop creative clusters or microclusters, that's one way of moving forward. So for instance, research also showed that companies in microclusters, wherever they are, get more of their new ideas from within their town, city or village, often within a 20-minute walk of their office. And I was quite astounded by that piece of research because, you know, I get quite a lot of inspiration from the internet and doing research that way. But obviously actually being within your community and partaking in that sort of community and being part of that microcluster obviously has much more benefits than that. So that's a really nice, interesting piece of research that came out from that. The research also tells us that microclusters outside of creative clusters, so don't forget the creative clusters are the large ones, the microclusters are more likely to want to grow and will more likely to have grown in the past year. So that's a really interesting piece of data. They were more likely to behave like companies in the bigger established creative clusters, obviously benefiting from proximity of skills, customers and knowledge. However, companies in microclusters outside the southeast were more likely to perceive access to external finance as a barrier to growth. So perhaps that's something that we could contend with in future projects for Somerset. And of course, this combined with the growth ambitions and higher levels of growth previously suggests that companies in microclusters have untapped potential for growth. So we can see that perhaps one of the strategies or the future for Somerset is to start to develop more of these microclusters within each district. And I think a fine example of this is also about physical presence. So, for instance, the conference that we had today was held at the Creative Innovation Centre, which is known as Kick in Taunton. And we also have another similar organisation that do film and media called Somerset Film, who are based at the Engine Room in Bridgewater. And actually, these are quite interesting engines of growth because quite often organisations will go into these particular buildings and start to be part of these networks. And in some instances, you'll see people starting new businesses, starting new community interest companies, getting access to knowledge, access to training. And these are the things that obviously grow organizations. So I think in some way it's a great idea to sort of look at these as great case studies, and perhaps we need more of these throughout Somerset. Now, the creative research that came out with some recommendations, one was that more should be invested in encouraging microclusters to emerge outside of the established large clusters. Investment in programs such as the ones I've mentioned earlier, Creative Scale Up or Creative Growth Program, would support them to grow further, which will give them the confidence and knowledge to access investment and funding. So really, going back to the lack of data for Somerset, we believe the investment strategy for Somerset should include further mapping of businesses, plus to include community organisations to develop a social value perspective. And of course, for a business support and development programme for microcluster areas and wider community support. So that's what we need to do. So if you've got a project that you're working in Somerset and it is covering, even if it's just a small area, you know, several businesses rather than one particular business, then I highly recommend that you look at the microcluster research and perhaps use some of that data as a way of supporting your own project or application for funding for your project. So next time you think arts and culture, think microclusters and creative clusters for Somerset.